There is a quiet courage in asking a simple question when power, cruelty, and confusion surround us. What is the real use of clear thinking? Voltaire's life is one long answer to that question. He did not build a grand system of philosophy. Instead, he turned thought into a moving light. Not a monument to admire from afar, but a lantern you can carry into the darker corners of the world. To walk with Voltaire is to enter a time when old certainties were cracking. Thrones and altars still claimed unquestioned authority, yet doubt had already begun its slow work. In that tension, Voltaire refused to replace one rigid dogma with another. His loyalty was not to any institution, but to a way of thinking clear, modest, and willing to be tested. Here we meet our first insight. For Voltaire, ideas must answer to experience. The new physics of Newton was his model look: measure, compare, revise. Speculative systems that soared far above the world, however elegant, were suspect. Thought, he believed, should begin where we can see and touch. Philosophy, if it is honest, returns again and again to what the world will actually bear. This leads to a second insight. Clear thinking for Voltaire is a public responsibility. He used wit, satire, and sharp clarity not as games, but as instruments against torture, religious persecution, and legal injustice. His call to crush the infamous thing was not a hatred of all religion, but a protest against fanaticism and the use of fear to rule minds. No claim, however sacred, should be beyond question when human suffering is at stake. A third insight runs quietly through his work, an affirmation of human happiness in this life. Against traditions that glorified suffering, Voltaire defended comfort, art, commerce, even luxury as signs that our condition can improve. Ordinary joys were not moral weakness. They were part of our dignity. Yet he never closed his eyes to chance, to injustice, to history's violence. His hope was steady, but never naïve. In this journey, we will not seek a final doctrine in Voltaire. We will practice with him a style of attention, critical but not bitter, hopeful but not blind. As you listen, you might notice where your own certainties rest, where they resist experience, and where a little more light could be allowed in. Part 1. Popularizing Science as a Weapon Against Error. Across the Channel, in the damp, smoky streets of London, Voltaire had discovered a different way to argue, not with scholastic treatises or solemn Latin disputations. Instead, he argued with letters, lively, descriptive, almost conversational reports from one world to another. When Voltaire returned to France, he began to shape his English impressions into these letters, writing as a traveller sending news to curious friends. He asked, what are the English sects like? How does their parliament function? Why do they tolerate so many forms of worship without chaos? Perhaps most shocking for a French audience, he investigated, how do the English think about nature? Here Voltaire saw an opportunity. He could smuggle a new method of thinking into France, disguised as cultural reportage. Instead of abstract arguments, he invited readers to observe how another nation handled religion, commerce, and, above all, science. He would hold up England as a mirror, allowing France to see its own prejudices reflected. This was the spirit behind the Letters Philosophiques. It was not a physics, textbook, or a formal philosophical treatise. It was something more mischievous and powerful, a work of popularization deliberately aimed at embarrassment. Voltaire described Newton not as a distant genius, but as an intellectual craftsman. Newton begins with phenomena, what the heavens do, how bodies fall, not with definitions from his head. From there, he reasons cautiously, always checking his steps against experience. For Voltaire, this was not just a scientific method, it was a moral style of thought. Descartes began with clarity of ideas inside the mind, while Newton began with clarity of facts outside it. For a culture steeped in speculative systems, this shift in starting point was truly revolutionary. Voltaire embraced this Newtonian style, turning it outward as a weapon against error. He explained gravity, optics, and celestial motion in plane, engaging language while staging a clear contrast. He placed English philosophers like Bacon, Locke and Newton, who used experiment against French Cartesians tracing invisible ether vortices. The physics details mattered less than the public drama. Voltaire urged readers to question elegant systems. He moralized method. Bad metaphysics was not just intellectual error, but a social danger. It trained people to accept beautiful stories instead of hard realities. Authorities understood the threat. When letters philosophiques appeared without approval, the reaction was swift and severe. The book was condemned, copies burned by the public hangman, and plans drafted to arrest Voltaire. This seemed disproportionate. Why fear letters on English religion, politics, and science so much? But the alarm was understandable. Voltaire was not just describing customs, but undermining French institutions' monopoly. He showed another arrangement of church, state, and knowledge was possible, and that it seemed to work. At Syrie, in exile, Voltaire transformed this scandal into a new role, an outlaw educator. His weapon was not secret doctrine or hidden manuscripts, but the clear, witty, and accessible book. In his Elements de la philosophie de Newton, he further developed this project. He spoke to the ignorant Frenchman not with contempt, but with strategic flattery and provocation. "You are clever," he implied, but kept in the dark by a backward establishment. "Let me show you how the English think." "Let me show you what?" "Light they have drawn from nature." The book is often called a machine de guerre, a war machine aimed at the old Cartesian guard. This captures something essential. Voltaire was not content to merely explain. He wanted to displace. He aimed to turn Newtonian science into new common sense, delegitimizing those built on older, speculative systems. Pause and notice science for Voltaire was not neutral, not just a box of facts. It was a style of reasoning that, once popularized, reshaped how people thought about everything else. If gravity acts without invisible vortices, perhaps laws work without divine right. If celestial motions have simple rules, maybe human affairs too can be governed by knowable principles, not opaque tradition. Voltaire never collapsed politics into physics, but sensed culture's imagination of nature influenced its imagination of power. By bringing Newton to the café, salon, and educated layperson, he wasn't just teaching astronomy. He was training a new reflex, distrust of grand stories untested by experience. This reflex, once formed in science, could spread, making people less patient with superstition. It could make them less tolerant of persecution justified by revelation, more inclined to ask, "How do you know?" The backlash from academic and ecclesiastical authorities confirmed the seriousness of his project. To them, Voltaire was not a harmless enthusiast, but an agitator. His easy prose, jokes, and stories about English inoculation were sugar coatings on a bitter pill. If people trusted empirically tested medicine, what other traditional powers might they question? There's a lesson about popularization itself. We often imagine making science accessible as a gentle, apolitical task. For Voltaire, it was a campaign. Clarity was a form of combat. He simplified not to flatter ignorance, but to arm it, giving non-specialists a grip on guarded ideas. Of course, he exaggerated and caricatured opponents, turning Descartes into a straw philosopher. Voltaire's Newtonianism was sometimes less precise, but its imperfections mattered less than the direction it pushed public attention. He taught his audience to honour the experimenter, consider doubt a virtue, and see science as a model. This model applied to disputes in religion, law, and politics: gather evidence, listen, and revise. In doing so, he anticipated a problem still shadowing us. Experts' clarity isn't enough for public responsibility. Specialists refine theory in journals, but if their work doesn't reach wider culture to change habits, error flourishes. Voltaire chose his side decisively, not content with correctness inside an ivory tower. He risked simplification, controversy, and exile to bring new ways of reasoning into common light. To popularize, in his hands, meant to democratize, making reserved knowledge usable by any curious reader. The weapon he offered was not a creed, but a practice look: compare, doubt, test. In a world where authorities burned books for teaching this practice, Voltaire's choice carried genuine danger. He believed thoughts worth having could be shared, not as dogma, but as tools for many. Science for him became less a temple and more a workshop, a place where anyone, with patience and clarity, could learn to separate asserted claims from what can be shown. Against error, he wagered, the surest weapon is not outrage, but understanding. Part 2. The Critique of Optimism and Leibnizian Metaphysics. Beneath the polished floors of royal academies and courts, another struggle was unfolding in Voltaire's century. Not a struggle over laws of motion, but over the laws, if any, that governed meaning itself. Why is there suffering? Why does evil exist in a world allegedly created by a good and wise God? What, if anything, can philosophy say to that? One answer, brilliantly constructed and enormously influential, came from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He argued, with intricate reasoning, that this world is the best of all possible worlds. Not perfect, certainly, but taking into account every possible balance of goods and evils, the most rational choice for an omniscient creator. Evil, in this view, is not a brute scandal. It is a necessary ingredient in a maximally ordered whole. For many thinkers, this metaphysical optimism was reassuring. It tied together theology, physics, and morality. It promised that behind apparent chaos lay a luminous architecture of reasons. What you and I perceive as misfortune is, at a higher level of analysis, part of a wise plan. Voltaire found this soothing picture deeply troubling, not because he took pleasure in despair, but because he thought that certain Forms of comfort are bought too cheaply. To justify every horror as necessary seemed to him less like piety and more like a failure of honesty. His unease grew in conversation with people very close to him. Émilie Duce Tellet, his companion in Syrie, had been drawn to Leibniz's metaphysical depth. She sought to reconcile Newtonian mechanics with Leibnizian rationalism, to weld empirical science to a strong, deductive structure about God, freedom, and substance. Another ally, Maupertuis, drifted in a similar direction. Voltaire watched this turn with increasing skepticism. To him, it risked repeating the old mistake he had already fought in Cartesianism, the temptation to let elegant reasoning outrun what experience could warrant. Once more, philosophy seemed in danger of soaring above the world, wrapping suffering in fine phrases rather than confronting it. His anti-Leibnizian instinct was not, at first, a full doctrine. It began as a posture, a refusal to let any metaphysical system close the case too quickly on the problem of evil, a suspicion of arguments that tried to deduce from the nature of perfection what the universe must be like. When Voltaire later satirized Leibnizian optimism in stories like Candide, he was sharpening a sword he had been forging for years. In those pages, he does not patiently refute each premise of the metaphysical system. He does something more direct. He places a naive disciple of optimism in a world of war, earthquake, cruelty, and random loss, and lets reality do the arguing. But even before that famous satire, we can see the lines of his critique. He believed that philosophy goes wrong when it tries to explain too much. The desire to account, in one glance, for every aspect of existence leads easily to a kind of moral anesthesia. If everything is already the best possible, then indignation is foolish. Reform is presumptuous. Compassion becomes, at most, a sentimental gesture in a divinely optimized machine. For Voltaire, this was intolerable. If clear thinking has any use, it must sharpen, not dull, our perception of injustice. It must increase, not decrease, our sense that cruelty is wrong, that needless suffering is not to be explained away, but, where possible, reduced. The clash with Maupertuis at Frederick the Great's court in Berlin gave this philosophical disagreement a theatrical stage. Maupertuis, now president of the Prussian Academy, leaned into a vision of the universe governed by metaphysical principles. Principles that, he believed, showed divine wisdom at work in even the smallest details. Voltaire, ever sensitive to pretension, began to see in this not only intellectual error, but a dangerous tendency toward dogmatic authority. His satire of Maupertuis was cruel, perhaps excessively so. He portrayed him as a despotic thinker, more interested in imposing a system than in listening to evidence or dissent. Frederick, forced to choose, sided with his Academy president and banished Voltaire. Once more, truth, telling, or what he took to be truth, telling, cost him his place in a glittering court. Yet beneath the personal drama lay a deeper question. How much metaphysics does an honest philosophy need? Voltaire's answer grew increasingly minimalist. He did not deny God outright. He did not claim that the universe was meaningless chaos, but he refused to believe that human reason could map the full logic of creation. We see he insisted from too low a vantage point, with too short a lifespan, and with senses too limited to deduce cosmic necessity. What we can see, however, is suffering. We can see judicial torture. We can see religious persecution. We can see war justified by abstractions. On these, we have enough evidence to act. And for Voltaire, that was where philosophy should concentrate its efforts. This is not a withdrawal from depth. It is a redefinition of it. Instead of plumbing the infinite reasons of God, he asks us to go deeper into the finite world we actually inhabit, to understand the mechanisms of superstition, the psychology of fanaticism, the economic and legal structures that make cruelty possible. Depth shifts from metaphysical architecture to historical and social analysis. Against Leibnizian optimism, Voltaire proposes not a counter-system, but a way of standing in the world. It has several components. First, epistemic modesty. Admit how little we know about ultimate purposes. Resist the urge to tell stories that tie up all loose ends. Leave some questions open, not because they are unimportant, but because premature closure risks falsehood. Second, moral seriousness. Refuse to call evil necessary until you have exhausted every mundane possibility for reducing it. Do not attribute to God what might be addressed by reforming laws, institutions, or habits. If a child dies of a preventable disease, the problem is not the structure of the possible worlds in the divine mind. It is the structure of this world's care. Third, practical hope. Not the sweeping assurance that all is for the best, but the narrower conviction that some things can be improved. That in a limited sphere, with patience, reason, and courage, one can lessen suffering. This hope does not rest on a guarantee from metaphysics. It rests on experience's small, past victories against ignorance and cruelty. In rejecting Leibnizian optimism, Voltaire is not embracing pessimism. He is resisting a certain kind of intellectual laziness disguised as faith. He would rather live with unresolved tension than buy peace of mind at the cost of truthfulness. His stance raises a question for us as well. Where in our own thinking do we use large theories about history, about progress, about human nature to comfort ourselves against the sharp edges of reality? When do we say it had to be that way, not because the evidence forces us, but because the alternative would demand too much of us? Voltaire's answer is not to abolish theory. We cannot think without patterns, without some wider frame, but he urges that our frames remain tentative, porous to facts corrigible. And above all, that no theory ever be allowed to silence compassion. The earthquake that destroyed Lisbon a few years after his quarrel with Maupertuis would become, for Voltaire, a symbol of this struggle. Thousands dead in an instant, crushed under the stones of churches and houses. What could best of all possible worlds mean in the face of such devastation? He listened to theologians, and philosophers interpret the event as punishment, as trial, as necessary. He heard, in much of it, an evasion. His poetic meditation on Lisbon does not offer an alternative system. It offers instead a protest, a refusal to align his language with any doctrine that made such suffering neat. He preferred a wounded honesty to a graceful lie, if clear thinking is, as we have been suggesting, a kind of light. Voltaire insists that this light must never be turned away from the darkest scenes. The storm, the ruin, the unjust execution, these are the places where philosophy proves its worth or reveals its hollowness. Optimism in his critique is not simply the belief that things will improve. It is the claim that they already could not be better. Against that, he opposes a humbler, more demanding creed. This world is what it is. Some of its horrors are beyond our power, many others are not. Our task is not to explain them away, but to see clearly which is which, and to act where we can. In turning away from Leibnizian metaphysics, Voltaire did not empty philosophy of meaning. He redirected it. From the investigation of why the universe exists as it does, to the examination of how we live within it. From justifying God to defending human beings. That shift, quiet as it may seem, marks a profound change. It is one reason why, when we speak of enlightenment, we so often find his voice near the centre. He did not give us the last word on evil or on fate. He gave us something more fragile and more usable, a reminder that no beautiful theory must ever make us indifferent to pain. Part 3. History as a tool for cultural enlightenment. In Voltaire's hands, history stopped being a shrine to kings and battles and began to look more like a long, complex conversation about how human beings choose to live together. He inherited a tradition in which history was largely a record of monarchs, wars, and miracles. The past was marshalled to prove that a particular dynasty was legitimate, that a particular church possessed the truth, that a particular social order reflected the will of God. In that narrative, ordinary people appeared only as a faceless mass, and events were stitched together by providence rather than by human causes. Voltaire did something quietly radical. He asked, what if, instead of telling us how power justifies itself, history showed us how cultures rise, change, and decline? What if we looked not only at kings and generals, but at laws, commerce, manners, prejudices, and arts? What if we treated the past as a field of evidence rather than a sacred legend? Out of those questions grew a new way of writing about the world. When he became royal historiographer of France, Voltaire received an official mandate to celebrate a glorious monarchy. Yet even as he fulfilled that role, his deeper project was moving elsewhere. In his essays on the customs and spirit of nations, he tried to trace something more elusive: the mental habits of entire peoples. The slow shaping of institutions, the spread of knowledge and superstition alike. For him, history was not only about what happened, it was about what people believed they were doing, what stories they told themselves about their actions, and how those stories hardened into tradition. Think of the difference. In a providential chronicle, a plague might appear as punishment for impiety. In Voltaire's historical eye, the same plague invites questions: how did the disease travel? Why were some populations more vulnerable than others? What role did ignorance, urban crowding, and religious processions play in spreading it? Where one narrative seeks moral confirmation, the other looks for causes that can be known and perhaps changed. That shift is philosophical. It means turning away from explanations that cannot be tested and tuning our attention instead to what leaves traces: documents, customs, laws, accounts of travellers, the dates at which technologies and ideas arrive. The past becomes, in his words and in his practice, a kind of laboratory of human behaviour. Voltaire's history is comparative. He had no interest in a story where Europe stands at the centre as the measure of all things. In his great historical work, China, India, Persia, and the Islamic world appear not as distant curiosities, but as civilizations with their own sciences, literatures, and forms of tolerance and cruelty. He insists that we notice that many forms of wisdom, justice, and refinement existed outside Christian Europe. This comparative gaze serves a purpose. Once you see that other societies have organized their lives, their laws, and their beliefs differently, it becomes harder to think that any particular arrangement is inevitable or divinely fixed. Slavery, torture, hereditary privilege, the fusion of altar and throne, all of these can now be seen as historical facts, not sacred necessities. History, in this sense, becomes a tool for loosening the grip of custom. When a practice wears the mask of eternity, it is almost impossible to question. But when the same practice is seen emerging at a certain moment, defended with specific arguments, and then modified or abandoned elsewhere, it returns to its proper scale. It is an invention, and what has been invented can be changed. Voltaire's use of history is also deeply connected to his preference for the empirical over the speculative. Just as he distrusted grand, metaphysical systems that float above experience, he distrusted histories that float above sources. The work of the historian, as he saw it, was to collect testimonies, compare chronicles, weigh probabilities, and admit uncertainty where the evidence is thin. That did not make him a dry chronicler. He was a storyteller with a clear sense of drama and irony. But he wanted the drama to arise from the clash between human intentions and realities, not from the direct intervention of invisible forces. There is a moral dimension to this approach. Voltaire was convinced that ignorance about the past feeds two dangerous illusions. The first is that our present arrangements are natural and unchangeable. The second is that they are the culmination of a steady, divinely guided progress. Against both, he offered a more adult view. Human beings, he thought, advance in some respects and regress in others. They improve certain arts while losing certain virtues. They stumble, forget, and rediscover. There is no guaranteed arc of redemption. There is only what men and women, in their times and places, manage to understand and to build. By tracing, for instance, the history of religious intolerance, he shows how often persecution grows not from faith itself, but from its alliance with political power. Councils, edicts, trials, and massacres appear not as isolated eruptions of madness, but as outcomes of institutions, of laws that punish dissent, of courts that defer to dogma, of rulers who fear questioning minds. History here performs an almost therapeutic function. It tears the mask of sacred inevitability from fanaticism and reveals its very human machinery. At the same time, Voltaire's histories do not only catalogue horrors, he is keenly attentive to the moments when light enters. The establishment of more humane legal codes, the spread of printing, the circulation of travel narratives that undermine provincial arrogance, the adoption of useful sciences and techniques, all of these become episodes in a quiet, uneven enlightenment of customs. The key word is customs. In choosing to write about moeurs, about manners and ways of living, he indicates that philosophy is not just a matter of abstract principles. It is embodied in what people eat, how they punish, whom they marry, what they read, how they pray, how they trade. To change a society's philosophy, you must in some sense touch its habits. History, therefore, offers something more than knowledge. It offers orientation. It helps a society see itself from outside as if it were one culture among many, one experiment among others, in the long human attempt to seek security, meaning, and pleasure. From that vantage point, pride is softened. Certainty, too. There is another element in Voltaire's practice that speaks to his time and to ours. He wrote history for a public that was beginning to emerge, beyond the court and the church, a public of readers in salons, coffee houses, and provincial towns. These readers were not professional scholars. They were curious, busy, and in many cases still tied to traditional beliefs. So Voltaire wrote with a clarity and liveliness that kept them engaged. He smuggled arguments into anecdotes, critiques into portraits, doubts into polished phrases. A joke about a king's vanity might quietly undermine the whole logic of absolute monarchy. A comparison between a tolerant emperor in Asia and a persecuting ruler in Europe might plant an unsettling but fruitful suspicion. In that way, history became an instrument of what we might call cultural enlightenment, not an enlightenment imposed from above by decrees, but one that occurs when readers begin seeing their own assumptions in a wider frame, when they realize that their prejudices have a date, that their institutions have a childhood, and may have an old age. Of course, Voltaire was not free of his own biases. He could be unfair, especially when mocking what he considered backward nations or beliefs. His praise of some societies and his critique of others rarely escaped the gravitational pull of his own social position. Recognizing this does not cancel his project, it refines our use of it. For if we take seriously his core, insight that history is an inquiry, not a catechism, we are invited to apply it not only to priests and princes, but to the philosophers themselves. We can ask how their hopes and blind spots were shaped by their milieu. We can observe how they, too, became part of a tradition that later generations would question. In doing so, we imitate the attitude he modelled, a loyalty not to particular heroes or doctrines, but to a way of looking. To see the past as layered, contingent, and partially knowable. To resist the comfort of simple arcs and single causes. To prefer patient attention to records over the elegance of moral fables. History as cultural enlightenment, then, is not simply a genre of writing. It is a discipline of the imagination. It trains us to inhabit times and places that are not our own, to see alternatives to what we take for granted. To perceive how power and belief interact over centuries, it reminds us that what looks eternal is often only old. And with that realization comes a further, more intimate one. Our own lives, our own institutions, our own moral certainties will one day be part of someone else's narrative. They, too, will be weighed, compared, perhaps pitied or admired. To live with that knowledge is to feel a gentle pressure to act in ways that might bear the light of a future historian's calm, unsparing gaze. That pressure is precisely what Voltaire hoped to create, by turning history into a mirror that reflects not divine plans, but human choices. He invited his readers and us to think more carefully about what kind of past we are making in the present. Part 4. Crushing the Infamy, the campaign against fanaticism. Far from being just a clever phrase, Voltaire's cry to crush the infamous thing was the distilled form of a long, deliberate campaign. He wrote those words from a position that was both vulnerable and powerful. Vulnerable because he chose to spend his last decades outside the shelter of official favour, in a borderland estate at odds with established authorities. Powerful because from that estate he built a different kind of influence, the influence of public opinion slowly awakening. When he spoke of the infamous thing, he did not mean religion as such. He meant a certain alliance of dogma and power, the attitude that treats opinions as sacred property to be defended at any cost. The machinery that turns priests into judges, judges into executioners, and citizens into instruments of fear. In short, he meant fanaticism, that fever of the mind by which people come to prefer the torture of bodies to the disturbance of a belief. Fanaticism, as he saw it, is not simply an excess of piety. It is a disease of imagination. A person becomes less attentive to the world in front of them, and more devoted to a picture in their mind, a pure community, a perfect doctrine, a spotless faith. Every doubt then feels like an attack on reality itself. Every deviation, a crime. To fight such a thing is difficult because fanaticism does not reason on the same terms as its opponents. It sees argument not as a path to truth, but as a test of loyalty. Every concession looks like betrayal. Every nuance resembles weakness. Voltaire understood this, and so his campaign against fanaticism had two faces, one of sharp attack, the other of patient illumination. The attack came in the form of satire. He wielded ridicule like a scalpel. In his stories, poems, and dialogues, fanatics are often shown as both cruel and ridiculous. They burn people while spouting clichés. They invoke God in the service of petty ambitions. They strut, they threaten, they contradict themselves. By making them objects of laughter, he sought to undermine the secret prestige of harsh certainty. Laughter for him had a serious function. It releases the spell of awe. It allows readers to see that the terrifying inquisitor is also a vain man in robes, that the censor who bans books for the glory of heaven may secretly crave status on earth. Once that perception lands, the hold of fanaticism on the imagination begins to weaken. Yet ridicule alone could not be enough. Human beings rarely abandon beliefs just because someone mocks them. Voltaire knew this, and so he went further. He gathered facts. He tracked down documents. He reconstructed trials. He turned himself, in key moments, into a kind of unofficial investigator of injustice. The most famous of these moments is the case of Jean-Calas, a Protestant merchant from Toulouse, accused of murdering his own son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Calas was tortured and executed. The local authorities, convinced of their own righteousness, ignored the contradictions in the evidence and the absence of motive. Prejudice supplied what facts could not. From his estate at Ferney, Voltaire took up the case. He corresponded with witnesses, collected depositions, published analyses, and used every contact he had to reopen the affair. His aim was not only to clear one man's name, but to expose an entire system in which religious suspicion tilted the scales of justice. In the process, He practiced the kind of clear thinking that his whole philosophy demands. Do not accept accusations because they fit a comforting story. Examine the record. Ask whether the alleged crime makes sense. Separate what is known from what is merely repeated. Insist that courts, too, obey the discipline of evidence. The Callous affair was not the only campaign. Voltaire intervened in other cases of religious persecution, including that of the Chevalier de la Barre, executed after a trial suffused with hysteria rather than proof. Each case became, in his telling, a symbol, not just of individual tragedy, but of a structure that allows cruelty to disguise itself as piety. This is where his motto becomes clearer: to crush the infamous thing is not to silence believers. It is to dismantle, piece by piece, the arrangements that permit belief to arm itself with chains and fire. It is to strip away legal privileges, unquestioned immunities, and the language of sacred exception that allows some people to stand above the ordinary obligations of justice. How does one crush something so diffuse? Voltaire's answer was by multiplying small acts of light. A pamphlet that explains a trial in calm detail. A letter that forces a minister to confront the absurdity of a verdict. A satire that makes the public laugh at what they had been taught to fear. A dictionary entry that, with a few lucid paragraphs, undoes centuries of confused argument. He did not imagine that a single book would overturn fanaticism. The infamous thing, after all, renews itself. It finds new doctrines, new flags, new slogans. But every time people learn to associate cruelty with disgrace rather than with honour, its roots loosen. In this sense, Voltaire is less interested in immediate victory than in changing what a culture admires. He wanted his readers to learn to feel a quiet shame at the spectacle of forced confession of bodies broken in the name of truth. He wanted them to see moderation not as lukewarm faith, but as a sign of moral seriousness. Notice how this connects to his larger view of human happiness. He did not demand that people abandon all religious consolation. He did, however, insist that no promise of otherworldly bliss can justify the torment of someone here and now. The measure of an idea, for him, is still the experience it produces in living bodies. Behind his polemics lies a simple, steady conviction that whatever name we give to the highest good, it cannot require us to shut our eyes to suffering. The voice that tells us to ignore a cry of pain because doctrine demands it is, in his judgment, the one that needs to be resisted most deeply. His campaign against fanaticism was also a campaign for a different kind of authority, the authority of reasoned agreement. Instead of commanding assent through threats, arguments should invite assent through their clarity and fit with observed reality. Instead of defining identity through dogmatic boundaries, communities should learn to tolerate a range of convictions, so long as none claim the right to dominate by force. Voltaire did not think this ideal could ever be perfectly realized. He had no illusions about human beings suddenly becoming gentle. But he believed that institutions could be nudged toward less cruelty. Legal codes could be reformed to abolish torture and temper punishments. Censorship could be relaxed. Minorities could be allowed to live without daily fear. From Fernie he pursued these reforms with the tools at his disposal: letters, friendships, fame. He flattered where it was useful, rebuked where he could, and constantly amplified the voices of those who argued for leniency and tolerance. In doing so, he modelled a form of engaged criticism that does not wait for perfection before acting. The campaign against fanaticism then was not a brief episode in his life, but its backbone. It gave shape to his varied writings, from compact dictionary entries to sprawling tales. It explains why he kept circling questions of intolerance, cruelty, and the manipulation of fear. For him, philosophy that ignores these questions is like a lamp that shines only in empty rooms. If we follow the thread of this campaign into our own time, we can see why his motto continues to provoke thought. Fanaticism has not disappeared. It has shifted its forms, attached itself to ideologies, identities, and even secular certainties. Whenever a belief, however noble in content, demands immunity from criticism and sanctions harm to preserve itself, the infamous thing has returned. To remember Voltaire at such moments is not to repeat his slogans mechanically. It is to recall the discipline he practiced, to document before denouncing, to separate persons from systems, to prefer patient exposition over pure outrage, and yet not to let politeness conceal injustice. There is, finally, a personal dimension to this struggle. Fanaticism is not only an external threat. It is a temptation in each of us, the wish to possess a final answer so fully that questions feel like insults, and those who ask them look less than human. Voltaire's satire hurts a little precisely because it reveals how easily ordinary people, defending what they love, can slide into cruelty. Crushing the infamous thing in that light is also an internal task. It is the effort to keep our own convictions porous to evidence, to remember that being wrong is a human possibility, not a disgrace that must be denied at all costs. It is the decision, renewed again and again, to place the relief of real suffering above the comfort of unchallenged belief. That decision was, for Voltaire, the practical heart of clear thinking. It is what turns philosophy from a private game into a public duty, and it is what gives his harshest words their underlying gentleness, an unwavering concern for the fragile, embodied beings who must live under whatever truths we choose to defend. Part 5. The Philosophy as Activist and Reformer. Amid shifting loyalties and changing courts, Voltaire gradually discovered a role that no official title could fully capture: the philosophy as a public actor. Earlier in his life, he had tasted both dependence and favour. He knew what it meant to court ministers, to enjoy pensions, to serve as an ornament of a royal regime. He also knew what it meant to be exiled, censored, and mocked as a dangerous wit, experiences that taught him something crucial about the balance between thought and power. This balance was delicate if thought is tied too closely to power. It becomes flattery. If it flees the world altogether, it becomes sterile. The figure of the philosophy emerged in his work and in that of his contemporaries as a different possibility. Not a professional scholar confined to libraries, not a court poet in service of a prince, but a writer who uses knowledge to question institutions, to propose reforms, and to support those who challenge injustice. This role did not appear in a vacuum. It grew within a widening network, the group of authors, editors, and correspondents who gathered around projects like the Encyclopedia. They did not all share a single doctrine. Some were deists, some more skeptical, some cautiously religious. They disagreed on metaphysics, on the nature of the soul, even on politics. What united them was a shared practice, a commitment to exposing error, to organizing knowledge, and to arguing for changes in law, education, and social customs that could reduce avoidable suffering. To call oneself a philosophy in this sense was to accept that ideas have consequences and that one bears some responsibility for those consequences. Voltaire embraced this identity with particular energy. From his retreat at Ferney, he turned what could have been a purely literary life into a kind of informal headquarters of reform. He hosted visitors, exchanged thousands of letters, and coordinated campaigns that linked distant cases and distant readers. He used his fame as a lever, pressing authorities to reconsider verdicts, promoting works that advanced humane causes, and quietly discouraging projects he saw as harmful. His activism took many forms. Some were large and visible, the interventions in notorious trials, the defences of persecuted minorities, the public polemics against torture and religious privilege. Others were modest, a supportive preface, a recommendation to a patron, a suggestion for a legal revision buried inside a witty essay. What makes this activism philosophical is not just its content, but its method. Voltaire did not simply shout for change. Instead, he tried to connect each demand to reasons that could be shared across different beliefs. When he argued against torture, he did not rest only on compassion, though that feeling is present. He also pointed out that torture produces unreliable confessions, that it leads courts to condemn the weak and spare the strong, that it undermines the very idea of justice. In doing so, he treats reform as an exercise in clarity. To reform is not only to want better outcomes, but to understand how existing systems actually function. Where do incentives point? Who benefits from confusion? Which words hide power behind abstractions? The philosophy, in his sense, is someone who keeps asking such questions even when they disturb comfortable certainties. Voltaire's own genre choices support this role. He rarely wrote heavy treatises. Instead, he favoured forms that could travel: letters, dialogues, tales, dictionary entries, plays. Each genre allowed him to bring critical reflection into spaces where dense philosophical argument would never reach. A merchant, a magistrate, a provincial noble, a curious artisan, any of these might meet his ideas in a brief article or a satirical scene. Not an audience of specialists, but a diffuse community of readers who, by sharing certain texts and references, began to see themselves as part of a common endeavour. They did not march, but they discussed, doubted, and occasionally opposed. In their salons and coffee houses, in their private reflections, the work of intellectual reform took root. At the heart of this activity lies a subtle shift in the meaning of authority. Traditional authority rests on lineage, ordination, or office. The philosophy, by contrast, claimed authority from something else, the capacity to explain, to show, to convince. That claim is fragile. It can always be tested by counter-argument and by experience. Yet it is precisely this fragility that makes it more compatible with liberty. Voltaire did not imagine that philosophy should rule. He did, however, believe that rulers should listen to them, praising monarchs who surrounded themselves with informed advisers who read, who were willing to adjust laws in light of new insights. When one of his friends, such as Turgot, entered government, he celebrated the appointment as a sign that reasoned reform might penetrate the core of the state. At the same time, he remained wary. He had lived long enough to see promising reforms thwarted, enlightened ministers dismissed, and generous plans undone by resistance and circumstance. This double vision gave his activism a particular tone, hopeful, but never infatuated. He encouraged progress, but did not confuse partial victories with final triumph. The philosophy as he embodied it is, therefore, not an all-knowing engineer of society. He is a critic with a lantern, moving along the edges of power, occasionally stepping inside, often being pushed back out, but always returning to the work of clarification. He translates complex insights into simpler language, uncovers the human costs of abstract policies, and reminds both rulers and subjects that no law is beyond question. This position raises its own questions. Who appoints such a figure? To whom is he accountable? Voltaire's answer is implicit. The philosophy is appointed by no one. His legitimacy, if he has any, derives from the transparency of his reasoning and the courage of his interventions. He is accountable, above all, to the realities he describes and to the people whose lives are affected by the ideas he spreads. Of course, he is not exempt from error or bias. Voltaire's own blind spots on issues of class, gender, and empire show the limits of any reformer who speaks from a particular social world. Recognizing those limits does not empty the role of meaning. Instead, it indicates what a mature understanding of the philosophy requires, not reverence, but a willingness to apply the same critical standards to him that he applied to others. Seen this way, the philosophy as activist is less a heroic figure than a function in a healthy culture. Someone must ask whether the stories society tells about itself still fit its realities. Someone must check whether laws intended to protect are now being used to oppress. Someone must remember forgotten victims when public attention moves on. In the 18th century, Voltaire helped give that function a name and a recognizable shape. His example also suggests that activism and reflection are not opposing activities but two aspects of one practice. Without reflection, activism can become impulsive, repeating the errors of the systems it opposes. Without activism, reflection can become a polished ornament, satisfying to contemplate, but indifferent to suffering. Voltaire's life, especially in its later decades, is an ongoing attempt to keep these two in contact. He read, he doubted, he argued, and then he acted, writing letters, raising funds, drafting pleas, supporting concrete reforms in criminal justice and religious policy. Each action, in turn, fed back into his thinking, sharpening his sense of what kinds of change were possible and where resistance was strongest. For listeners today, the figure of the philosophy as activist and reformer poses both an invitation and a warning. The invitation is to see thinking as a form of participation in the world, not a retreat from it. Each time we clarify a confused issue, detect a hidden assumption, or patiently correct a falsehood, we are already acting as minor philosophies in his sense. The warning is that such participation will not be comfortable. To question what has long been taken for granted is to risk misunderstanding, hostility, even punishment. Voltaire's exiles and quarrels, his conflicts with powerful friends, remind us that clear thought is rarely welcomed by those who benefit from confusion. Yet his persistence also shows why the role matters. Over time, small acts of clarification accumulate. Legal codes shift. Punishments soften. Public language becomes a little less violent. No single philosophy can claim credit for these changes, but without their sustained work, many of them would not occur at all. In the end, the activist philosophy is not a saviour, but a companion. Someone who walks alongside the slow movements of history, pointing out preventable harms and possible improvements, never entirely satisfied, never entirely despairing. This is the stance Voltaire offers, critical, engaged, and modest about its own reach. To adopt it is not to imitate his style or his opinions, but to share his conviction that ideas belong in the open air. Ideas that can be tested against facts and directed toward the relief of real suffering. That, for him, is what gives philosophy its dignity and its weight in the world. Part 6. The Secular Saint and the Legacy of Criticism. In late winter of 1778, Paris staged a kind of miracle that owed nothing to relics or incense. A frail old man, his body worn by exile, lawsuits, and decades of controversy, was welcomed back into the city as if he were a conquering hero. Voltaire's return was not quiet. Crowds gathered. His new play was performed not simply as theatre, but as a ceremony. The audience did not just applaud the work. They rose for the author himself. A statue was commissioned even before he died. The figure in stone would outlive the fragile body that inspired it. In a culture that had spent centuries bowing before kings and saints, this was something new. A philosopher treated as an object of public devotion, no longer merely a clever polemicist or troublesome critic, Voltaire became a symbol. He was not canonized by the Church, but he was canonized all the same. To call him a secular saint is to notice this shift. Sanctity, once grounded in miracles and obedience to religious authority, was being rewritten in secular terms. Courage in the face of censorship, sympathy for the wrongfully condemned, devotion to clarity and reason. These became the new marks of holiness. The shrine was not an altar, but a theatre, a printing press, a public square. Yet there is a paradox here. The man who spent his life mocking idols was turned into one. The writer who dismantled legends around kings and priests became the centre of his own legend. Even the stories told about him began to harden. The critical voice was embalmed in marble. The question is whether this transformation preserves his spirit or silently betrays it. Part of the answer lies in the kind of philosopher Voltaire chose to be. He did not set out to build a grand metaphysical cathedral. He preferred small, sharp tools. A definition here, a satirical tale there, a letter that exposed a judge's cruelty, or a pamphlet that ridiculed a fanatic. He left behind no single book that crowned his system. Instead, he left a style of attention and a model of the philosophy as public critic. In that model, the philosopher is not first of all a builder of intricate theories, but a citizen armed with clarity, someone who enters public conflicts, takes sides for the oppressed, and tests every lofty principle against its human consequences. Voltaire helped fix this image in European memory, the thinker in the world, not above it. The measure of an idea, on this view, is not its elegance in the study, but its capacity to ease suffering, reduce superstition, and make life a little more bearable. This way of thinking about philosophy left deep marks. When Karl Marx later wrote that philosophers had only interpreted the world and must now change it, he seemed to be speaking a new revolutionary language. Yet behind that demand stands an older figure. Voltaire had already insisted, through his life more than his treatises, that ideas are not innocent. They organize power. They justify cruelty or expose it. To write for him was to intervene. The French Revolution sealed this connection between critical thought and political upheaval. In 1791, the revolutionary government created a new kind of temple, the Pantheon, dedicated to the great men of the nation. Voltaire's remains were among the first to be transferred there. The procession resembled a secular pilgrimage. Banners celebrated him as the man who had prepared the revolution. His coffin passed under arches bearing the words, "He taught us to be free." Here the symbolism intensified. A writer who had been, in life, a cautious reformer and a monarchist of sorts, was reborn as a founding father of republican modernity. The revolutionaries chose from his legacy what they needed: his attacks on fanaticism, his contempt for arbitrary power, his defense of persecuted Protestants. They were less interested in his doubts about popular government or his lingering respect for a well-advised king. The secular saint was already being simplified. This simplification continued as Voltaire's figure moved beyond France. In the broad culture of the modern West, he came to stand for a cluster of attitudes: skepticism towards dogma, trust in reason, biting wit in the face of solemn authorities. He also became the patron of a particular ideal of free speech. The sentence most often placed in his mouth is, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This famous quote, however, is one he never actually wrote. Yet the misquotation has proven stubbornly resistant to correction. Why does this imagined sentence cling so tightly to his name? Perhaps because it encapsulates what later generations wished him to be: the pure voice of liberal tolerance, untainted by the roughness of his actual quarrels and prejudices. The myth is revealing. It tells us less about the historical Voltaire than about the hopes and anxieties of those who needed him. They wanted a saint of criticism whose faith was in liberty of thought above all else. Still, behind the myth, there is something real. In his vast correspondence and in many of his pamphlets, we find not just attacks on beliefs he found absurd, but protests against the idea that error alone justifies persecution. He could despise a doctrine and yet defend the legal protection of those who held it. He intervened in cases where people were tortured or executed for their religious views, even when he found those views foolish. Civil liberty mattered more to him than doctrinal correctness. In this sense, Voltaire's canonization is not merely a trick of memory. It acknowledges that he helped carve out a modern sense of what a public intellectual could be. Someone who does not simply interpret the past, but actively contests the injustices of the present. Someone who risks comfort by confronting the powerful. Someone who takes the side of the accused when public opinion has already condemned them. Yet the risk of sanctifying such a figure is obvious. Once a critic becomes a symbol, it is tempting to admire rather than imitate, to quote rather than question, to invoke Voltaire as a charm word against censorship, against fanaticism, while avoiding the unsettling work of applying the same relentless scrutiny to our own institutions, our own party, our own convictions. Perhaps the most faithful way to honour a secular saint of criticism is not to protect his memory from dispute, but to keep disputing. To remember that Voltaire himself changed his mind, wrote carelessly at times, and sometimes reproduced the very prejudices he fought elsewhere. His true legacy is not a perfect doctrine, but an insistence that no authority, not even his own reputation, should be above examination when human lives are at stake. Seen in this light, the statue, the pantheon, the invented quotations are all secondary. What matters is whether we are willing, as he was, to let thought step out of the library into the world. To ask how our beliefs touch courts, prisons, schools, and streets. To use clarity not as a weapon of humiliation, but as a fragile instrument of care. The secular saint is only useful if he keeps bringing us back to that simple, demanding practice of criticism. In the end, Voltaire's lasting gift is less the glow of his legend than the discomfort of his questions. When we find ourselves tempted to look away from cruelty because it is customary or sacred or profitable, his figure reappears, sharp, impatient, asking quietly what use our intelligence is if it cannot be spent on those who suffer. That more than any monument is the legacy of his criticism. Part 7. The Paradox of Determinism and Moral Responsibility. During Voltaire's century, philosophers did not argue about freedom in the abstract warmth of a seminar room. They argued under the shadow of a new kind of universe. Newton had shown that planets, tides, and falling apples all obeyed precise mathematical laws. The sky, once the realm of angels and miracles, now looked like an immense clock. The question followed naturally: if nature is a network of causes, what room is left for human choice? At one extreme stood a stark determinism. On this view, every action is the unavoidable result of prior motions in the body and the world. Will desire, character, these are merely names for arrangements of matter following strict necessity. At the other extreme rose a spiritualist picture. The soul was described as a purely immaterial substance, capable of choosing independently of bodily influence, lifted above the chain of causes like a little god. Voltaire moved between these poles with characteristic wariness. He mistrusted both the cold comfort of mechanical necessity and the vague consolations of metaphysical freedom. In an unfinished metaphysical treatise, and later in the entries, Free, Will, and Liberty, in his philosophical dictionary, he tried to clarify what we actually experience when we think we are free. The starting point, for him, is simple observation. Look closely at yourself when you act. You want, you hesitate, you compare, you choose. Behind each movement of the will you find a passion, a fear, a memory, a hope. Desire pushes, aversion pulls. Our so-called will is never naked. It is always clothed in feelings, In this sense, Voltaire thought the will is not autonomous. It is always being moved. He liked examples drawn from ordinary life. Imagine someone who finds a purse on the road. They feel the pull of greed, but perhaps at the same moment they recall a lesson from childhood or imagine the distress of the person who lost it. A second feeling, shame or compassion, rises to meet the first. The eventual action, keeping the purse or returning it, results from the stronger of these inner forces. There is no mysterious third power that chooses without being itself affected. To many of his contemporaries, this picture looked like a surrender. If every decision is driven by passions and impressions, does anything like freedom remain? Voltaire's answer began with a careful distinction between two words that are often treated as synonyms to wish and to be able. To wish, he said, is simply to desire. To be free is to be able. You can wish for anything at all. To travel back in time, to walk through walls, to undo a harsh word already spoken. None of these wishes give you the power to do what you imagine. They float like images with no weight in the world. For a choice to be free in any meaningful sense, the desire that motivates it must be linked to a power, to a real capacity in your body and circumstances to carry it out. This is why, for Voltaire, the will is always entangled with the constitution and present state of our organs, as he liked to put it. Your nerves, your habits, your memories, your social position, these determine not only what you want, but what you are able to make of your wants. The will is never uncaused. It is a crossroads where many causes meet. On the surface, this looks like an argument against moral responsibility. If my decisions grow from a web of causes I did not choose, birth, education, temperament, how can I be blamed for them? Voltaire refused this conclusion. He agreed that we are never the first link in the chain, but he also believed that the chain can be redirected. Within necessity, there are possibilities. To explain this, he turned again to examples. Picture a man consumed by desire for a woman. His passion urges him toward a violent act. At that moment, another image arises in him, the suffering he would cause, the shame he would feel, perhaps the punishment he would face. This second impression does not come from nowhere. It may have been formed in him by gentle parents, by books, by religious teaching, or by seeing others suffer. If it is vivid enough, it can weaken or even overcome the passion. Notice what has happened. The man's action, whether violent or restrained, is still fully determined. It flows from the strongest present motive, operating through his bodily constitution. Yet there is a clear difference between a character in which countervailing motives exist and one in which they are absent. Moral education, on this view, is the art of building up within people those inner powers, horror at cruelty, pleasure in generosity, pride in fairness, that can contest their more brutal impulses. Voltaire drives this point home with the image of a brigand and his accomplice watching an execution. The punishment, he suggests, is useful only if it strikes the accomplice's organs with terror. If he feels nothing, he may go from the scaffold straight back to robbery and murder. If he is overcome by horror, that new feeling can redirect his future actions. In either case, his later choices are determined by how his body and imagination have been affected. Here the paradox begins to soften. We do not need a will that floats above causes to speak of responsibility. We need a being whose actions proceed from its own formed character, and whose character can itself be shaped. Education law, religion, and example all work by arranging impressions in such a way that certain motives will tend, in the future, to prevail over others. This view has several ethical consequences. First, it undermines absolute blame. If someone has become cruel or dishonest, we must see them as a product of conditions as well as of choice. Their actions remain theirs, they stem from their own desires, but these desires are not inexplicable eruptions. They have histories. To punish without trying to understand and alter those histories is, in Voltaire's eyes, both ineffective and unjust. Second, it humbles our pride in virtue. When we resist a temptation or act generously, we tend to credit a pure freedom in ourselves. Voltaire invites us to look more closely. Perhaps we had loving parents, good teachers, a temperament inclined to sympathy. Perhaps we were fortunate enough never to be pushed to desperation. These two are causes. Recognizing them does not erase praise, but it softens it with gratitude. Third, it reframes the role of reason. Reason for Voltaire is not a cold spectator standing above the passions. It is one passion among others, or better, a way of ordering them. When we deliberate, we imagine consequences, compare pleasures and pains, project ourselves into the future. These operations themselves are feelings and images striking the body. The more clearly we can foresee, the more power these refined passions have to compete with immediate urges. Modern science has, in some ways, vindicated his intuition. We now speak of neurons and hormones instead of organs stricken with horror, but the basic picture is similar. Experiences leave traces in the nervous system. Habits reinforce certain pathways. Training and trauma alike become embodied. Our sense of freedom coexists with a body in which causes are endlessly at work. Of course, Voltaire's account does not dissolve every difficulty. If all of our attempts at moral education, our exhortations and punishments, are themselves determined, is it meaningful to say we ought to use them wisely? Voltaire's answer is quiet. The language of obligation is part of the machinery by which we influence one another. To tell a story, to praise, to blame, to set a law, these are ways of entering into the web of causes. Determinism does not silence ethics, it frames it as a practical art. What matters, then, is not whether there exists a mysterious faculty that could have chosen otherwise in some eternal sense. What matters is whether we can, by knowing more about ourselves, redirect the causes that shape us toward less suffering and greater happiness. The paradox of determinism and responsibility loses much of its sting once we stop demanding an impossible, uncaused freedom and begin attending to the real degrees of power we have. Voltaire's solution remains modest. It does not promise that everyone can become virtuous, nor does it excuse every crime. It asks us, instead, to relocate the drama of freedom from a metaphysical instant to the long, slow work of formation. Each story we hear, each example we witness, each law we pass, becomes part of the invisible architecture within which future choices will unfold. To live with this view is to see ourselves neither as puppets nor as little gods. We are animals gifted with memory and imagination, caught in currents we did not create, yet capable of steering them a little by how we teach, punish, forgive and reform. In that narrow but real space, Voltaire finds all the freedom he needs to keep speaking of duty, virtue and guilt. If we accept his invitation, we stop asking whether we are absolutely free and start asking a different question. Given the causes already at work in us and around us, what can we do, here and now, to bend them away from cruelty? The answer, for him, is the true measure of our moral responsibility. Part 8. Civil Liberty and the Materiality of the Soul. Beyond metaphysical disputes, Voltaire's reflections on the soul began from a simple intuition: whatever we are not ghosts floating above our bodies. We suffer in nerves, tremble in muscles, rejoice in pulses of the heart. Our thoughts catch fire or grow dull depending on sleep, food, illness, and age. To ignore this is to build castles in the air and call them philosophy. Influenced by Locke and the new natural philosophy, Voltaire treated the soul less as a mysterious substance. He considered it more as a name for our capacity to think and feel. That capacity, he believed, is inseparable from the body's organization. Change the body through education, habit, trauma, or wine, and you change the way the soul appears. He did not claim to solve the ancient puzzle of mind and matter. Instead, he refused to thicken the mystery with dogmatic assurances about an immaterial essence. This refusal put him close, in the public imagination, to the materialist currents of his time. Radical deists like John Toland and Anthony Collins spoke openly of thought as a function of matter. The Encyclopédie Dai's article on the soul treated it in daringly naturalistic terms. This approach caused scandal. Voltaire, in his more provocative moods, echoed these themes. He insisted that all our mental powers are tied to sensations. He argued that to speak of an entirely spiritual faculty, untouched by the senses, was to indulge in empty words, and yet his position was more nuanced. As with so much in his thought, his public polemics suggested a simpler view. In private manuscripts he entertained various possibilities, sometimes leaning toward a cautious agnosticism about the soul's ultimate nature. But in his popular writings, he chose to press the implications of our embodied condition, not because he delighted in shocking the devout for its own sake. Rather, he saw in the doctrine of a purely immaterial soul a long history of abuse. When authorities claim custodianship over souls, they often demand obedience from bodies. They promise eternal rewards and threaten endless punishments for beliefs and doubts that no one fully controls. In this economy, heresy becomes a crime worse than murder. Torture becomes a regrettable but holy instrument. Voltaire had seen too many people burned, broken, or silenced in the name of saving their souls. If instead we admit that thought grows from experience, that beliefs are shaped by teaching, climate, language, and the thousand accidents of life, then persecution takes on a different light. To punish someone for their creed is to punish them for causes largely outside their choosing. The path from cradle to conviction runs through parents, priests, books, and neighbours. Responsibility remains, but it is mixed with shared causality. Here the link between the materiality of the soul and civil liberty becomes clear. Once beliefs are seen as part of the natural order, not as direct verdicts of an untainted spiritual faculty the state's claim to police. Thought looks both arrogant and irrational. You cannot whip someone into truth any more than you can beat a fever out of a patient. Coercion may change behavior or silence speech, but it cannot, by itself, produce understanding. Voltaire's practical conclusion was straightforward. If error is a natural phenomenon, the proper response is not the scaffold, but argument, example, and education. Let books answer books. Let sermons be met with counter-sermons. Let the marketplace of ideas, flawed as it is, work on those impressionable organs that he believed underlay all judgment. Civil liberty, especially freedom of speech and of religion, becomes the political expression of this deeper view of the human person. He did not, however, extend this principle without reservations. Voltaire was not a democrat in the modern sense. He doubted the capacity of the majority to guide themselves by reason alone. For those capable of patient inquiry and self-discipline, he trusted that a natural morality could be found. This natural morality could be found without the props of dogma. For the rest, he often argued, religion was a necessary support. Belief in a watchful God, he thought, could restrain crimes where abstract ethics would fail. This elitism sits uneasily beside his image as a champion of liberty. On the one hand, he defends the right to think and right against censorship. On the other, he condones, at least in theory, a certain use of religion to keep social order among those he saw as less enlightened. The materiality of the soul did not lead him to embrace full political equality. It led him instead to a layered vision of society, in which different minds might need different kinds of guidance. Still, even within this hierarchy, his commitment to legal protections was unmistakable. Whatever he thought about the masses' need for religion, he raged against judges who condemned people for heresy or blasphemy. He intervened in notorious cases where young men and obscure artisans were tortured or executed for irreverent acts or careless words. His letters and pamphlets in these campaigns are driven by a simple conviction. No temporal authority has the right to destroy a body in order to correct a belief. It is in this context that the famous misattributed sentence about defending to the death another's right to speak finds its emotional truth. Voltaire did not write those exact words, but again and again he acted on their spirit. He defended Protestants in Catholic France, criticized the Catholic Church in Catholic countries, and mocked power. He mocked power in the language that power itself understood. Civil liberty, for him, was not a slogan. It was a daily risk taken with the pen. His influence on later thinkers shows how deeply this stance resonated. When Kant defined enlightenment as the emergence from self-imposed immaturity through the public use of reason, Kant was giving philosophical form to a practice Voltaire had embodied, the idea that citizens should be free to argue in print and speech, even about religious and political matters, without fear of punishment. This idea owes as much to Voltaire's campaigns as to any abstract principle. Notice, too, how this vision of liberty rests on a quiet shift in what we mean by soul. In medieval theology, the soul's highest good was often placed in the next life, and its purity measured by obedience to correct doctrine. In Voltaire's world, the soul shows itself in the capacity to suffer, to enjoy, to understand, here and now. To respect a soul is to respect the living, vulnerable being who bears it. Torture, censorship, and persecution become not only errors against truth, but direct assaults on that being. The more we think of ourselves as naturally formed and embodied, the more our politics turn toward this world. Debates about salvation give way slowly to debates about rights. The question shifts from how shall we save souls to how shall we prevent cruelty. Voltaire stands at this threshold. He does not close the door on transcendence, but he refuses to let promised heavens justify present hells. For us, living in societies that still struggle over speech, belief, and bodily autonomy, his tension remains instructive. We, too, know that convictions arise from histories we did not choose. We see how media, schooling, and economic conditions mould minds. We also feel the temptation to silence what we fear, to imagine that the right law could simply banish error. Voltaire's wager is that a frank acknowledgement of our material, shaped, vulnerable souls makes censorship not only wrong, but implausible as a path to truth. If we are to live together, with different pasts and different impressions, we must protect the space in which these differences can be expressed without fear of violence. Civil liberty is not a luxury of comfortable times. It is the practical form taken by a clear-eyed view of what human beings are. To embrace this view is to accept responsibility for the conditions under which minds are formed. It is easier to blame an individual soul for its errors than to face the institutions and habits that fed them. Voltaire prods us to the harder task: improve education, open access to books, rid law of cruelty, and reduce the temptations to fanaticism that arise from poverty and humiliation. Treat the soul not as a disembodied point of light, but as a living, learning creature housed in flesh. In that picture, civil liberty and the materiality of the soul are not opposed. They belong together. The more we understand how fragile and conditioned our inner life is, the more urgently we see the need to shield it from coercion. Voltaire's legacy here is the simple, demanding thought that, to honour what is most subtle in us, we must first protect what is most exposed: our speaking bodies, our printed words, and our shared, contested space of public reason. Part 9. The Ethics of Hedonism and Body Positivity. In warm, candlelit rooms of the 18th century, the human body was often spoken of in two different languages. One language came from pulpit and catechism. It called the body a source of temptation, a burden to be disciplined, a gateway to sin. The other language emerged in salons, in poems, in whispered laughter between friends. It treated the body as capable of joy, of tenderness, of shared pleasure that needed no apology. Voltaire stood firmly in this second camp. For him, the defence of liberty did not stop at parliaments, courts, and printing presses. It extended all the way to the bedroom, the dining table, the dressing mirror. He refused a vision of morality that began from suspicion of the flesh. Instead, he asked a disarmingly simple question: if a pleasure harms no one, why should it be condemned? Behind this question was a deeper conviction. A just ethics must start not from hatred of the body, but from an honest inventory of human happiness and human pain. Voltaire's hedonism was not an invitation to endless excess. It was a protest against needless suffering dressed up as virtue. He had watched as priests praised celibacy while abusing their power. He had seen men and women locked in loveless marriages sanctioned by law and church. He knew the misery created by rules that demanded abstinence from ordinary joys, only to excuse cruelty carried out in the name of God. Against this he set a different standard: what increases well-being, what reduces cruelty, what allows people to live without shame in their own skin. In that sense, his outlook anticipates what we would now call body positivity. Voltaire did not preach acceptance through slogans or self-help manuals. He did something subtler. He refused to treat the physical body as an enemy that must be overcome. Wrinkles, appetites, desires, aging, these were not marks of moral failure, but signs that we are natural beings subject to time and sensation. To despise the body, he thought, is to despise the very medium through which we experience love, friendship, art, and even thought itself. His poems and stories often carry this message in playful disguise. Lovers are not punished by thunderbolts. Desire is not automatically tragic. When a character suffers because of sex, it is usually because of hypocrisy, jealousy, or repression, not because the act itself is forbidden by some cosmic order. Voltaire invites his readers to imagine a world in which consent and mutual enjoyment, rather than prohibition, form the core of sexual ethics. That invitation is already a way of loosening the chains of inherited shame. At the heart of his hedonism lies a simple calculus. We should seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for ourselves and for others. This sounds obvious, almost trivial. Yet it quietly overturns entire moral systems that glorify sacrifice for its own sake. If fasting, self-flagellation, or celibate misery do not lead to a real reduction of suffering in the world, then they are not virtues. They are at best personal choices. At worst they are tools of control, teaching people to mistrust their own sensations and obey external authority. This way of thinking does not grant every desire the same dignity. Voltaire's satire is quick to target pleasures that depend on domination or cruelty. The joy of a torturer, the thrill of a fanatic watching a heretic burn, these are not the pleasures he defends. His ethics draws a line between joys that can be shared without degradation and those that feed on humiliation and fear. A hedonism worthy of the name, he suggests, must be democratic. It must imagine a community in which as many people as possible can pursue harmless enjoyments without terror or guilt. Seen from this angle, his attacks on religious asceticism are not merely about sex or diet. They are about dignity. A culture that treats the body as filthy or dangerous easily accepts the humiliations of torture and corporal punishment. If pain is cleansing, then why not use it freely? If pleasure is suspect, then why not surveil and regulate it with an iron hand? Voltaire answers by reversing the moral polarity. He insists that what needs justification is not joy, but deliberate suffering imposed by others. There is also a psychological insight at work. Shame about the body rarely remains confined to the body. It seeps into thought, into speech, into the sense of what one is allowed to desire in life more broadly. A person taught to feel unclean for wanting physical affection may also learn to feel unworthy of knowledge, of wealth, of social standing. Voltaire's laughter at prudishness is not just mockery, it is a strategy. By making rigid chastity look ridiculous, he undermines a whole architecture of control that grows out of bodily shame. Yet he was not blind to the dangers of indulgence without reflection. Diseases, unwanted pregnancies, dependence, exploitation, these shadowed the pleasures of his age just as they do ours. His answer was not to retreat into prohibition, but to call for honesty and responsibility. Pleasure becomes ethical when it is lucid, when it counts its real costs, when it treats other people not as instruments but as companions. In this way, his hedonism is not opposed to prudence, it is prudence freed from the grip of superstition. In the modern language of body positivity, one often hears an insistence on self-love. Voltaire might have been wary of that phrase. He distrusted large, solemn words, but he would have recognized the need to replace self-contempt with something more humane. For him, the first step is modest. Stop lying about what we are. We are not pure spirits temporarily trapped in flesh. We are beings who think with bodies, who reason with brains that tire, who love through eyes, hands, and skin. To build an ethics that denies this is, for Voltaire, to build on sand. His celebration of bodily pleasure is therefore inseparable from his broader campaign against fanaticism. A person allowed to enjoy ordinary happiness is harder to terrorize. A society that treats comfort and health as real goods is less likely to sacrifice its citizens on the altar of abstract ideals. From the right to enjoy one's body, it is a short step to the right to seek material prosperity, to engage in trade, to pursue luxury without automatic moral suspicion. In Voltaire's world, the path from erotic freedom leads naturally toward his defense of commerce and worldly refinement. Hedonism in his hands becomes more than a private lifestyle. It is one front in a larger battle for a humane civilization. It challenges those who claim that virtue requires the mortification of the flesh and the suspicion of joy. It asks us to measure our ethics not by how sternly we can renounce, but by how concretely we can reduce suffering and expand harmless delight. From this basis, he will go on to argue that even the glitter of luxury and the hum of markets can, under the right conditions, serve the cause of human flourishing rather than corrupt it. Part 10. Luxury commerce and the progress of civilization. Across glittering shop windows and bustling ports, Voltaire saw something that many of his contemporaries missed. Where moralists detected only vanity and greed, he glimpsed a new kind of social fabric emerging. Fabrics from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, porcelain from China, scientific instruments from England, all passed through European hands in a dance of desire and calculation. To some, this was the visible face of decadence. To Voltaire, it was also the visible face of progress. In older religious visions, luxury was almost automatically a sign of moral decay. Fine clothes, good wine, rich food, elegant houses, these were temptations that led the soul away from God. The ideal was poverty, renunciation, a life stripped of ornament. Voltaire did not deny that greed and vanity existed. He had lived long enough at court and among financiers to see their more sordid sides. But he refused to accept that the mere presence of comfort and refinement must be a fall from grace. Perhaps he suggested the story was more complicated. He began from his usual starting point: human happiness in this world. If luxury meant excessive waste that left others starving, it was clearly indefensible. Yet what about the moderate enjoyment of beauty and convenience? A thick carpet in a cold room, a well-crafted chair for an aging back, a library of well-bound books, these were not empty symbols. They were tools that made life more bearable, more pleasant, more ordered. And when such comfort spread beyond a tiny elite, they could signal something profound: the slow, uneven rise of a broader standard of living. Commerce was, in his view, the main engine of this diffusion. Trade connected distant peoples through mutual interest rather than mutual fear. In a marketplace, a buyer and seller may come from different religions, nations, or languages, yet they find a common vocabulary in price and quality. Voltaire delighted in describing scenes in which a Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, and a skeptic transact business without asking one another about metaphysical commitments. Money, for all its dangers, can be a powerful solvent of sectarian hatred. He was well aware of the scandals stirred up by thinkers who suggested that private vices might yield public benefits. The idea that the pursuit of self-interest, be it in greed, sensuality, or vanity, could somehow lead to higher employment, technological innovation, or improved infrastructure shocked defenders of traditional morality. Voltaire did not embrace every version of this thesis, but he shared its central intuition: human society is too complex to be judged by simple maxims that condemn all luxury as corruption. In his historical writings, he traced the rise of commerce as a civilizing force. Cities that became centers of trade tended to develop more tolerant laws, better roads, more stable institutions. Merchants needed contracts to be enforced, currencies to be stable, violence to be predictable rather than arbitrary. A tyrant who could seize goods on a whim would soon find trade drying up. Thus the very needs of commercial life put pressure on rulers to respect property and, indirectly, certain basic forms of liberty. What theologians demanded in the name of divine law, merchants quietly demanded in the name of profit. Voltaire took pleasure in contrasting the rhetorical enemies of luxury with their actual behaviour. Priests who thundered against expensive fabrics did not necessarily refuse fine linens themselves. Aristocrats who praised Spartan simplicity did so from ornamented salons. Hypocrisy was, as usual, one of his favourite targets. But beyond the laughter, there is a question that reverberates into our own time. Is it possible to distinguish between corrupt luxury and civilizing comfort? Between a consumerism that hollows out the soul and a material culture that supports human development? For Voltaire, the answer turns again on experience and consequences. A luxury that ruins families in debt, that demands the exploitation of distant slaves, that channels energy into empty rivalry, this fails any reasonable test of human flourishing. But a luxury that encourages craftsmanship, that spreads knowledge, that funds art and science, stands on a different footing. A patron who spends lavishly on a telescope, an observatory, or a printing press is not simply indulging a whim. He is helping to create tools that extend the reach of human understanding. This does not absolve commerce of its darker sides. Voltaire wrote in an age when global trade was already entangled with colonization and forced labor. His own condemnations of religious cruelty did not always extend with equal clarity to the economic brutality of empire. Yet even here, his underlying logic offers a critical resource. If the value of commerce lies in its contribution to shared prosperity and peace, then any form of trade that rests on dehumanization betrays its own rationale. The same reasoning that justifies toleration and comfort also undercuts the moral defense of exploitation. Luxury, in Voltaire's thought, also plays a psychological role. It softens manners. A society obsessed with honor and war valorizes hard virtues. Courage, discipline, sacrifice. A society that loves music, fashion, and theatre cultivates different qualities: taste, conversation, sensitivity. While he did not wish for his country to become militarily weak, he frankly preferred the minor vices of an elegant court to the brutal fanaticism of religious wars. Silk and porcelain can be complicit in injustice, but they do not, by themselves, light pyres. The progress of civilization, then, is not a straight march toward moral purity. It is a tangled movement in which new forms of wealth and desire create new possibilities and new dangers. Voltaire's optimism, such as it was, rested not on a belief that history inevitably improves, but on the observation that certain material changes tend to encourage milder, more tolerant ways of living. He would have agreed that greed and pride never vanish, but he wagered that a world of shops and stock exchanges might, on balance, be less cruel than a world of dungeons and inquisitorial courts. Where does this leave us in an age of global consumption on a scale he could scarcely imagine? His thought does not provide us with ready-made answers. It does, however, suggest a lens. Instead of condemning or celebrating luxury in the abstract, we can ask concrete questions. Who benefits from this comfort? Who pays for it in labor, in health, in ecological cost? Does this form of wealth widen the circle of those who can live decently, or does it tighten a hierarchy of privilege? These are questions that respect his insistence on experience over abstraction. In linking luxury and commerce to the progress of civilization, Voltaire remains faithful to the themes that guided his defense of bodily pleasure. He resists moralities that idolize suffering and suspicion. He looks instead for arrangements, economic as well as ethical, in which more people can lead lives that are less harsh, less dominated by fear, more open to art and conversation. But he knows that the glitter of goods can also distract from clear thinking. To prevent that, another of his commitments must come into play: the discipline of skepticism, used not to poison joy, but to keep our desires from becoming new idols. Part 11. Skepticism as intellectual hygiene. At times, Voltaire's most radical gesture was to stop short of an answer. Surrounded by systems that explained everything, the origin of the universe, the structure of the soul, the secret meaning of suffering, he cultivated the courage to say, "I do not know." This was not laziness masquerading as wisdom. It was a deliberate practice, an intellectual hygiene designed to protect the mind from infection by comforting illusions. In his world, certainty came in many costumes. Theologians claimed it by revelation, metaphysicians claimed it by reason alone. Astrologers, alchemists, and fortune-tellers claimed it by esoteric insight. Each promised a map of reality that left no room for error. Voltaire's skepticism was a refusal to buy any of these maps at full price. He had watched too often as people killed and died for the contours of such diagrams. If leaps of faith were going to be taken, he believed, one should at least know that one is leaping. The metaphor of hygiene is helpful. Just as we wash our hands not because dirt is evil, but because some forms of dirt carry disease, so Voltaire washed his thoughts of unexamined beliefs. Not every tradition, not every habit of speech, not every inherited doctrine is poisonous. Many are harmless, some are positively beneficial. But without the regular cleansing of doubt, we cannot distinguish the nourishing from the toxic. Skepticism for him was not an end in itself, but a tool for preventing the spread of dogma. Crucially, he did not treat doubt as a dramatic crisis. There is little of the anguished soul-searching that fills the pages of more romantic thinkers. Instead, skepticism appears in his writing as a kind of dry, persistent housekeeping. An elaborate theory is presented. He gently asks where the evidence is. A story of miracles is recounted. He quietly wonders whether a more ordinary explanation might suffice. A philosopher constructs an edifice in the clouds, Voltaire points out, with a smile, that human beings still live on the ground. This attitude set him apart from forms of skepticism that use doubt only as a temporary stage. Some thinkers begin by questioning everything, only to rebuild certainty on a new foundation, reason, intuition, the self, or God. Voltaire was suspicious of such journeys. To him they too often resembled the very philosophical romances. He opposed imaginative constructions that soothe the mind with coherence rather than confront it with the complexity of experience. He preferred a skepticism that does not seek to be overcome, but to be integrated into daily thinking. His admiration for figures like Montaigne and Socrates is telling. From them he drew the idea that the admission of ignorance can itself be a stable philosophical position. The wise person is not the one who has resolved every question, but the one who knows which questions are, for now, unanswerable. That knowledge frees energy for more modest, but more fruitful tasks, observing nature, reforming laws, relieving suffering. If ultimate explanations lie beyond our reach, this is not a tragedy. It is an invitation to focus on what we can in fact improve. Skepticism in this sense protected Voltaire from two temptations. The first was fanaticism. If no human authority can claim infallible access to truth, then no church, monarch, or philosopher may demand absolute obedience. By constantly asking, "How do we know this?" he undermined the sacred aura that shielded institutions from scrutiny. The second temptation was despair. A person who expects certainty in all things will be crushed when confronted with ambiguity. By lowering the demand for absolute knowledge, he made room for a resilient, modest form of hope. There is also a moral dimension to his doubt. When a new doctrine appears, political, religious, or philosophical, Voltaire's first question is not simply, "Is it true?" but also, "What does it do to people? Does it sanction persecution? Does it comfort tyrants? Does it excuse injustice as part of a cosmic plan? Skepticism acts here like a litmus test. Any belief that demands cruelty in order to maintain itself should, he thought, immediately fall under suspicion. The burden of proof lies with those who would harm others in the name of their certainties. This is why he directed his sharpest skepticism not at simple folk beliefs, but at grand systems wielded by the powerful. He did not spend much time debunking every superstition of ordinary villagers. His energy went instead toward exposing the pretensions of learned men who used complexity to intimidate. If a metaphysical doctrine cannot be explained plainly, if it grows ever more obscure when challenged, Voltaire's instinct is not to admire its depth but to question its validity. Obscurity for him was often a sign of poor thinking or deliberate evasion. Yet his skepticism has limits. He did not dismiss all knowledge claims as equally uncertain. He embraced the empirical methods of science not because they produced final truths, but because they came with built-in mechanisms for correction. An experiment can be repeated, a prediction can fail, a measurement can be refined. Here was a kind of knowledge that openly acknowledged its own fallibility. For a skeptic like Voltaire, this was not a weakness but a strength. It matched his view of human minds as finite instruments working within a stubborn world. So skepticism, as he practiced it, does not end in paralysis. It clears ground. It removes what is unsupported so that more modest, more reliable structures can be built. He is willing to affirm certain things, that cruelty is an evil, that unnecessary suffering should be reduced, that freedom of thought is preferable to censorship, that tolerance is better than persecution. These are not deductions from metaphysical first principles. They are conclusions drawn from long acquaintance with human misery and human kindness. Calling this attitude intellectual hygiene stresses its ongoing nature. One does not wash once and for all. New forms of dogma arise. Old superstitions resurface in secular costumes. Ideologies claim scientific status while demanding uncritical belief. Voltaire would have recognized many of these patterns. His remedy remains the same: keep asking simple questions, keep demanding evidence proportionate to the claim, keep noticing when explanations grow ornate, precisely where the facts are thinnest. In our own time, skepticism is sometimes confused with cynicism. The cynic assumes from the outset that everyone lies, that good motives are a mask for power, that truth itself is a naive hope. Voltaire's skepticism is different. It is animated by the belief that clearer thinking can genuinely lessen human suffering. If that were not the case, there would be little point in exposing error. His doubts serve life. They strip away illusions that justify pain so that more honest arrangements may take their place. Seen alongside his hedonism and his defense of luxury, this skeptical hygiene performs a balancing role. Pleasure can become a new idol if it is not examined. Commerce can become a new superstition if it is treated as an infallible engine of progress. Skepticism keeps even our cherished values under gentle pressure. It reminds us that no ideal, whether ascetic or hedonistic, spiritual or material, should ever be spared the question. That lay at the center of Voltaire's thinking. What does this belief do in the actual lives of human beings who can feel pain and experience joy? In that question, humility and responsibility meet. We admit the limits of what we can know about the universe while taking full ownership of what we can see plainly, the effects of our actions on one another. If there is a cleanliness of the mind, for Voltaire, it consists in this: refusing to let our hunger for comforting explanations outweigh our attention to suffering. Such hygiene leaves the lantern of thought clear enough for its light to reach, however faintly, into the darker corners where it is still most needed. Part 12. Rejecting the philosophical romance. In Voltaire's century, philosophy often arrived dressed like a novel. Grand systems promised to explain everything, at once God, nature, the soul, history, even happiness. They moved from a few clear ideas to an entire universe, stitched together by elegant arguments and a great deal of imagination. Voltaire watched this performance and quietly stepped aside. He had read the masters of doubt before him. From Montaigne he learned a gentle skepticism, beginning with the confession, "I might be wrong." From Pierre Bayle he inherited a sharper edge, a skepticism that could dismantle whole theologies and metaphysical systems with careful argument. What Voltaire absorbed from them both was a simple but demanding thought. Skepticism is not merely a starting point on the way to certainty. It can be a destination. This is where he broke decisively from one of the great figures of his age, Descartes. Descartes began with doubt, but treated it as a ladder to be kicked, away once a secure platform of clear truths was reached. For Descartes, skepticism was a method, not a home. Once complete, a new structure appeared, a metaphysical world of immaterial minds. This included extended matter and a perfectly rational God who guaranteed the whole system. Voltaire called this structure a philosophical romance. The word romance matters. It suggests invention, a narrative that fills in the gaps where direct knowledge is missing. Philosophical romances are not lies in the crude sense, they are fictions woven from reason and desire. They answer questions we feel must have answers. What is the soul made of? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does evil exist if God is good? Faced with silence, the philosophical romancer refuses to leave the space empty. He builds, he imagines, he explains. Voltaire distrusted this impulse. The very act of providing a total explanation often signaled that philosophy had slipped into fantasy. When speculation goes beyond what can be tested, argued, or experienced, it stops being a guide to life. It becomes a kind of entertainment for the intellect, elegant, sometimes beautiful, but misleading. For him, the truly courageous answer to many ultimate questions was, we do not know. To say no explanation is available can be more philosophical than to invent one. Ignorance, when openly admitted, can be a form of integrity. This refusal to spin romances was not a purely intellectual posture. It connected directly to Voltaire's passion for liberty. When a church claims to know the secret will of God, it can demand obedience in his name. When a monarchy claims a metaphysical basis for its power, it can declare itself beyond criticism. When metaphysical systems pretend to map the structure of the universe, they easily turn into blueprints for organizing society. Against all of this, skepticism is a shield. If no claim is unquestionable, no authority is absolute. Voltaire's private religious views were subtle. He was not the simple enemy of all belief, some later admirers imagined. But he was fearless in challenging institutional religion and clerical power. He attacked the public use of dogma to justify cruelty. This included censorship and inequality. Skepticism became his tool for dissolving the supposed mysteries on which these powers rested. If miracles are doubtful, if doctrines contradict, if metaphysical justifications fall apart, then the authority leaning on them begins to tremble. He extended this same suspicion to philosophical authorities like Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz. In Voltaire's writing, they appear not just as thinkers, but as storytellers who have forgotten they are telling stories. Their universes, full of invisible vortices, pre-established harmonies, and monads without windows, looked less like reality. They seemed more like intricate tales, meant to soothe the anxious mind. They made the world intelligible at the price of honesty. From this angle, Voltaire often resembles a modern Socrates, more interested in questioning than constructing a system. Like Socrates, he cultivated a public persona that insisted on not knowing. Wisdom in this style is about recognizing limits. The true philosopher, Voltaire suggested, is not the one who can explain everything, but the one who dares to admit what cannot be explained. And yet he also parted ways with Socrates in an important respect. Socrates trusted rigorous dialogue and logical argument. Voltaire, watching metaphysical systems, saw the same tools used to fortify dogma. Reason could harden into what it opposed. It could become a machinery of arguments that defended prejudice instead of exposing it. So he chose another weapon style. Satire, irony, and wit became his way of loosening the grip of philosophical romance. Where a metaphysician built a system, Voltaire wrote a tale. Where a dogmatist offered logical proofs, he offered jokes. He used exaggerations and scenes so absurd they forced the listener to step back and see the assumption behind them. In doing so, he transformed rhetorical play into a form of intellectual hygiene. Laughter washed away false solemnity. This was not mere mockery for its own sake. The jokes cut toward a serious end to free individuals from the spell of stories that claimed too much. When he made fun of fussy scholars debating how many angels could dance on a pin, he was attacking thought that forgot its limits. Philosophy, he believed, should walk with a certain lightness, aware that it is always partial, always revisable. Living without philosophical romances does not mean living without beliefs. Voltaire relied on probabilities and common experience. He also relied on the practical wisdom of everyday life, trusting clear evidence and plausible inference. What he rejected was the leap from such modest grounds to total visions. Between dogmatic certainty and nihilistic despair, he carved out a third way. A life led under the sign of questioning, but not frozen by it. In the next step of his journey, this attitude would find a new ally. If systematic metaphysics could not be trusted, perhaps another activity could show what honest knowledge looks like when it stays close to the world. For Voltaire, that model was emerging in the laboratories, observatories, and workshops of his time. There, he thought, one could see what it means to take facts more seriously than fantasies. Doubt and experiment joined forces. Part 13. The Epistemology of Empirical Fact. Among careful observers of the early 18th century, something remarkable was taking shape. A different kind of authority was emerging, one that did not speak in the language of prophecy or metaphysical certainty, but in the quiet grammar of experiment, measurement, and calculation. Voltaire came to see this new authority as the best answer both to dogmatic faith and to dreamlike philosophy. The name attached to this change was Newton. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica offered an astonishing achievement, a mathematical description of how bodies move, both on earth and in the heavens. For centuries, thinkers had tried to understand the cosmos by telling a story of causes. Aristotle spoke of final purposes and natural tendencies. Later mechanical philosophers imagined the universe as a vast machine of tiny particles colliding, pushing and pulling. Each new theory promised not just to describe what happens, but to explain why it must happen that way. Newton quietly shifted the question. He showed, with unmatched rigour, how bodies in space actually behave. He derived laws that fit the observed motions of planets and falling apples with eerie precision. But when pressed to say what gravity is, or how bodies can attract each other across empty space, he refused the traditional role of the philosopher. He would not feign hypotheses, he said. He would not invent invisible mechanisms to satisfy the hunger for a deeper why. From the standpoint of older natural philosophy, this looked like an evasion. A real explanation, critics insisted, must involve causes that we can picture, swirling vortices of subtle matter, or particles pushing through an unseen ether. Newton's approach, they complained, offered only description, not understanding. To say that bodies attract one another in proportion to their mass and inversely to the square of the distance was, in their eyes, to rest content with a pattern, not a reason. Newton and his followers replied, the demand for such reasons had become a trap. Faced with phenomena that cannot yet be traced to mechanical pushes and pulls, philosophers were inventing new fluids, new particles, new kinds of matter that no one could observe. An ethereal ocean that explained the motions of the planets was, they argued, a romance no less fanciful than the old occult qualities of Aristotle. The commitment to explanation at any cost had led back to the very obscurity it claimed to banish. In this context, empirical fact took on a new dignity. What mattered first was that a claim matched observation and could be confirmed by repeated tests and careful calculation. A scientific law was no longer required to reveal the inner essence of things. It was enough that the law allowed us to predict, with remarkable accuracy, what would happen under given conditions. Explanation in the older metaphysical sense became a secondary concern or even a temptation to be resisted. Voltaire did not contribute new mathematics or experiments to this revolution. His genius lay elsewhere in recognizing its philosophical significance and making it visible to a broader public. Exiled in England, he encountered a culture in which experimental science was not merely an academic pursuit, but a shared pride. He learned from English and Dutch Newtonians, many of them French exiles, how bitter the debates were between Newton's defenders and the partisans of Descartes and Leibniz. In their vocabulary he found a new way to talk about knowledge itself. When he returned to the continent, he became Newton's interpreter. In his letters on England and later works, he translated dense mathematical arguments into narratives that curious readers could grasp. He contrasted the heavy machinery of Cartesian vortices with the simple clarity of Newtonian gravitation. More importantly, he drew out the lesson that mattered most to him. You can be rigorously rational without pretending to see farther than your evidence allows. This was an epistemology of humility, instead of building systems from a few supposedly self-evident truths. Voltaire urged thinkers to begin with what could be observed, measured, or at least anchored in experience. Reason was still crucial, but its role shifted. Rather than dictating how the world must be, reason became the tool for organizing and comparing facts, for testing hypotheses, for resisting the seductions of a theory that was beautiful but unsupported. On this point, Voltaire's path sometimes ran parallel to that of David Hume. Both distrusted the claims of abstract rationalism. Both insisted that all knowledge, if it is to be more than wordplay, must ultimately answer to experience. But where Hume pushed skepticism so far that he questioned even our belief in causation and the self, Voltaire stopped earlier. He was less interested in mapping the exact limits of human understanding than in finding a reliable style of thinking for practical life. His allegiance was to working scientists and craftspeople who could show, in the most literal sense, that their ideas worked. Empirical fact, for Voltaire, was not confined to the laboratory. It became his weapon in public debates. Take his advocacy for smallpox inoculation. Opponents of the procedure drew from religious scruples, intuitive horror, and abstract arguments about interfering with providence. Voltaire responded not by constructing an alternative metaphysical theory of disease, but by pointing to numbers, mortality rates in England, where inoculation was more common compared with those in France. The statistics were imperfect by modern standards, but the principle was clear. If one practice led, on the whole, to fewer deaths, that fact carried more weight than any chain of speculative reasoning. A similar pattern underlies his most famous philosophical tale, Candide. On the surface, the story mocks Leibnizian optimism, the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. But beneath the satire lies an epistemological critique. Optimism, as he presents it, is not just morally callous, it is a theory that survives only by ignoring evidence. Earthquakes, massacres, betrayals, and absurd misfortunes pile up, and still the optimistic philosopher proclaims that all is for the best. This is precisely the kind of system that empirical thinking must reject. A scheme so flexible that no possible fact can count against it. The famous conclusion of Candide that we must cultivate our garden is often read as a retreat into private life. Seen through Voltaire's Newtonian lens, it is also a call to redirect our attention from speculative totalities to manageable realities. A garden is small, particular, and sensitive to experiment. You try, you observe, you adjust. You are judged not by the elegance of your plan, but by whether anything grows. Work in this sense becomes a form of applied empiricism. In everyday ethics, as in science, Voltaire preferred what could be tested. A policy that reduces suffering is better even if we do not fully understand every underlying mechanism. A belief supported by robust observation is safer than a principle that floats above experience. This did not mean abandoning ideals, but rather subjecting them to the discipline of the real. By embracing the epistemology of empirical fact, Voltaire found a way to answer skepticism without betraying it. He kept the modesty of doubt while gaining the firmness of evidence. Yet one question remained open: if science should be grounded in fact, what should become of the grand metaphysical questions that had once been its foundation? His answer would be as radical as it was simple: let science do its work without them. Toward leaner forms of knowledge, Voltaire took a further step. It was not enough, in his view, to respect empirical fact. One also had to protect science from a constant pressure. The urge to turn it back into metaphysics, to make it speak about ultimate realities that no experiment could ever reach. To see what he was resisting, it helps to recall what metaphysics meant in his time. It was the branch of philosophy that tried to answer the deepest questions about being. What are bodies in themselves? What is the essence of motion? How do mind and matter relate? Are there immaterial substances, hidden forces, pre-established harmonies? These were not idle speculations. In earlier centuries they provided the framework within which physics operated. You began with a theory of substance and cause, and then you tried to fit observed phenomena into that pre-existing mould. Newton's achievement had loosened this structure. He showed how far one could go in describing the motions of bodies without making strong claims about what those bodies ultimately are. His gravity acted as if bodies attracted one another at a distance according to a precise law. How that attraction occurred he left open. For some of his contemporaries, this restraint looked like a failure. For Voltaire, it looked like liberation. Not everyone agreed. One of the most brilliant minds in Voltaire's own circle, Émilie du Châtelet, was drawn to Leibniz, who insisted that a complete physics must rest on a clarified metaphysics. For Leibniz, the world could not be fully understood as a collection of inert particles pushed and pulled in space. He introduced monad's immaterial units of perception and conceived force as something deeper than the simple product of mass and velocity. Du Châtelet worked to reconcile this vision with Newton's results, weaving together precision physics with a rich theory of substance and power. Voltaire admired her intellect and respected her learning, but he rejected her project. When he wrote a small work with the provocative title, The Metaphysics of Newton, the point was gently ironic. Newton, he argued, had succeeded precisely by not indulging in metaphysics. The tract praised the decision to bracket questions about ultimate nature and to focus instead on what could be measured, calculated, and confirmed. This stance came to define his side in the debates of the 1740s, against those who wanted to build physics on a thick metaphysical foundation. He defended a more austere picture. Let physics deal with quantities, relations, and observable effects. Let it describe how bodies behave under different conditions. Leave to metaphysics those questions that cannot be settled by experiment. Or better yet, stop pretending that such questions must have definitive answers at all. The so-called vis viva controversy, which centered on the correct way to measure force, became one battlefield for these issues. Was force proportional to mass times velocity, as some Cartesians held, or to mass times velocity squared, as Leibnizians argued? Behind the formulas lay deeper disagreements about what force is in itself. Voltaire gravitated toward the more mechanical, empirically grounded notion: talk about what you can observe and calculate, not about an inner, metaphysical essence of power. To him, the attempt to smuggle a philosophy of spirit or vital force into physics risked repeating the old confusion between clear description and speculative storytelling. His quarrel with Maupertuis illustrated the same concern in a more personal and theatrical way. Maupertuis, once a champion of Newtonian methods, grew increasingly interested in bold metaphysical principles, such as the idea that nature always acts by the least possible quantity of action. Voltaire responded with satire that, at times, shaded into cruelty. Behind the jibes, however, lay a serious accusation. When a scientist begins to treat his speculative principles as unquestionable truths, he slips from inquiry into dogmatism. Metaphysics, in this sense, does not merely add decoration to physics, it can distort it, tempting the investigator to bend facts to fit a favourite theory. Voltaire's hostility to metaphysics in science was not driven only by technical worries. It was tied to his larger political and moral hopes. Metaphysical systems had long provided fuel for priestly and monarchical authority. A church could claim access to the true nature of God and the soul. A king could claim that his power flowed from a metaphysical order of hierarchy and divine right. When philosophers built grand structures that echoed these patterns, they unintentionally lent their prestige to the same forms of domination. By stripping science of metaphysical pretensions, Voltaire aimed to disarm one of the subtle weapons of authority. A physics that confines itself to describing regularities in nature leaves less room for sanctifying social arrangements as necessary reflections of cosmic law. If gravity is simply how bodies behave, not an expression of a moral order, then political and religious hierarchies lose one of their noblest alibis. This is one reason later generations would see in Voltaire a forerunner of positivism, the philosophy that treats genuine knowledge as limited to what can be established through observation and scientific reasoning. From Auguste Comte, who dreamed of a society guided by the sciences, to later defenders of testable, falsifiable hypotheses like Karl Popper, and even to outspoken critics of religion such as Richard Dawkins, a certain lineage can be traced. In each case, there is a suspicion that metaphysical talk often conceals untested assumptions, cultural habits, or sheer prejudice. Of course, Voltaire did not share all the ambitions of these successors. He did not imagine a complete scientific reorganization of society, nor did he think that getting rid of metaphysics would automatically make humans virtuous. His aim was more modest and more targeted. By keeping science close to experience and free from speculative burdens, he hoped to make it a reliable ally in the struggle against superstition, cruelty, and needless suffering. Yet there is a cost to this purging that he never fully resolved. Metaphysical systems, however fanciful, often tried to satisfy a real human need. The desire for a comprehensive picture of reality, a sense of how our finite lives fit into a larger whole. When science refuses to speak about ultimate meaning, that longing does not disappear. It seeks other outlets, sometimes in new ideologies that can be just as dogmatic as the religions they replace. Voltaire's solution was not to deny this need, but to redirect it. Instead of demanding final answers, he invited his readers to accept partial understanding and to focus their moral energy on what can be changed. We do not know why the universe exists, but we can oppose torture. We cannot say with certainty what the soul is, but we can improve laws, education, and public health. In this sense, the refusal of metaphysics is not a retreat from seriousness, but a reorientation of seriousness toward the human scale. Seen from our own time, this stance can feel both familiar and unfinished. We live in a world saturated with scientific language, where empirical fact still competes with resurgent dogmas and new philosophical romances dressed in technological clothing. Voltaire's insistence that science should stay close to what can be shown and not drift into authority, giving metaphysical claims, remains a live challenge. He did not give us a final worldview. What he offered instead was a discipline: keep your concepts lean, your claims accountable to experience, and your imagination on a short leash when it pretends to know the invisible. In place of the towering systems that dominated his youth, he left a different image of thought, a set of modest but steady lights moving across the surface of the world, revealing enough for us to act with a little more clarity and a little less cruelty.